Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a PMDG 777 beta tester. In this video I want to give a little shout out and a little caution to those 777 pilots operating in FS 2024. You might have noticed that things are a little bit different with the 777 in FS 2024 than they are in FS 2020. And if you don't follow proper procedures, then you might experience engine failures while flying your aircraft. Now, let's go over what exactly has changed and why this is so important in FS 2024 only, where FS 2020 wasn't really affected. For that, let's hop into the cockpit and start having a look. So we are sitting here for our pre-flight procedure for our American Airlines Flight 66 from New York to Barcelona. A lovely little 7-hour transatlantic night flight. Now, you can already see that I did start to configure my displays for a little bit, and you can see I pulled up the status display on the captain side, the doors on the first officers, and then the bottom screen. Right now I have the engine page open with it, which is basically one of the pages that we'll be looking at in today's video. Now, back in the day, in FS 2020, all those options that you had were stored for a particular livery. That means, for example, today we're flying the 754 Alpha November, and therefore you would have a little file in your work folder that would be titled something like November 754 Alpha November.ini or whatever, and in there you would have a record of your airplane's service. Now, if you have the Store Fluids on Exit option active, you will find that one under PMDG Setup, Options, Simulation, and then on here on the third page, Save Fluids on Exit. Then what would happen is that the fluids of each particular livery would be stored in that ini file, and therefore the next time you call the aircraft up, that very same fluid state would be restored. However, there is a little caveat with this in FS 2024. Back in the days in 2020, Asobo allowed the developers to set a custom registration for each livery that gets loaded. So when you were to load this particular beautiful bare metal livery with this particular beautiful performance over here, then you would automatically have that livery loaded or that registration loaded inside of the simulator as well. As a result, you would also get the correct options. So if you have an airline options package, you would get that, and you would also get the correct fluid if this Save Fluid on Exit is turned on. By default it's off, by the way, so this is really only interesting if you have this turned on, which I would highly recommend. Now in FS 2024 things are a little bit different, and it is no longer possible for developers to set this option. Therefore, if you do not set the registration manually each time that you load up a livery, which by the way I would not recommend to do, but for a different reason that will be explained in a different video, then you will basically have the same internal default Asobo registration for every single aircraft. You can check this by going into the PMDG setup aircraft, and up here you can see that we indeed have that Asobo registration, Alpha Sierra X-Ray Golf Sierra. And this means that not only will you have the same equipment across every aircraft, but most importantly, you will also have the same operating fluids across each different livery. And for this reason, even though my last flight was a 3-sector flight from Amsterdam to Quito over to Guayaquil and back in the KLM 777, right now sitting in the American 777, we still have the same oil usage and the same hydraulic and APU oil usage as we had in that other aircraft. For this reason, you need to follow the preliminary pre-flight procedure, or the preliminary cockpit preparation as Boeing calls it, correctly, which after turning on the ADERU calls for you to check your operating fluids. So you check the engine oil quantity and also the hydraulic quantities and the APU oil quantity. Now the hydraulic and the APU oil don't use up that quickly. Basically, the hydraulics very rarely need a refill at all. The APU a little bit more often, but still you can operate it for many hours before something happens. The engines are different though. The engines basically need to be filled up after every 2 or 3 flights. respectively after around about 20 to 25 flight hours, depending on the engine type and so on. And this is something that really shows. So you can see down here we have 23 quarts of oil on the left side, 24 on the right hand side. Well, a full tank would be quite a bit more, depending on the engine variant, would be between 26 to 28 quarts. So you can see that we've really used up quite a bit of our oil already. And this is what you need to keep an eye on. So the recommendation here would be that either you do the mathematics, so the minimum you need with the engine stopped is 8 quarts plus 0.8 per flight hour of the expected flight length, but I honestly recommend to do things a little bit different. So in the real world, before an aircraft like the 777 can depart for an ETOPS flight, the engineers actually need to conduct an ETOPS check. And this pre-departure service check, PDSC as it's called, includes checking the oil quantity, and many airlines also make it standard procedure that the engineers have to refill the oil quantity before each ETOPS flight, so that you always have maximum oil in the engine. And that is kind of what I recommend you guys to do as well. So how do you do that? Well, you go over here into the Universal Flight Tablet, ground operations, then you go over to ground maintenance, and over here you can refill the engine oil. You also get a little indication of how much you actually have on board down here in the visual schematic. However, to be on the safe side, just hit refill engine oil. Now let's have a look over here, and you can see our oil quantity goes all the way back up to 28. Now, this is an important step to do, and this is a very important check to do, because when the oil quantity runs too low, and exactly where this triggers is a little bit different depending on the engine. For some it triggers at about 12, for others a little bit higher, for others a little bit lower. So it depends on the engine variant that you have in your aircraft. But when the oil quantity becomes too little, then metal may contact metal in your engine, aka something turning very fast may contact something static. And the result of that is almost always going to be spectacular videos going up on the internet the moment the airplane lands, if you have high-speed Wi-Fi on board even while the airplane's still flying. Note to myself, whenever we do get those nasty engine failures, turn that broadband switch off if you have it installed. Alright, so this is pretty important and a very important check for you guys to do, to ensure that you have sufficient oil on board. Now, if you do actually use a custom registration for each aircraft, and if you actually enter those in the aircraft selection menu in FS 2024, then you are not so likely to encounter this, because, well, at least you would have to fly the same plane over and over again. Again, oil quantity is usually sufficient for at least 2 long hauls, even with a short haul in between, but after that, for like every third long haul flight, you should really check that oil quantity. And even if you're just doing short haul flights, the 777 is out for long enough by now that if you've never known about this, you could eventually start running into that situation as well, where you have slowly used up all the oil you had and eventually run into that type of situation where metal meets metal. And I'm not talking about very good music over here, I'm talking about the fancy stuff that ends on YouTube. So that's the standard checks that I would recommend every one of you to do in each pre-flight procedure. That's also why it is so important that we cross-check these, again, in the real world as part of the pre-departure service check that many airlines even conduct at outstations. Well, all airlines who fly ETOPS conduct those at outstations, but many also refill the oil during that check at outstations. So do pay good attention to that, just to ensure that you are not accidentally going to fail your engines at some point in flight where you really don't want that to happen. Well, my friends, and that's all I have to offer for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope that you all enjoyed this one. I do hope that you all learned something over here and that it prevented one or the other virtual accident. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to see you all again on the next one. In the meantime, please be sure to like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.